Hello everyone. Today we're going to be talking about effects. Specifically in this video we're going to talk about the basic categories of effects that you have available to you. Video, audio, transitions, titles are what we're going to cover, but there's also generators and themes as well that we'll cover in the next video. And so it's just going to cover a portion of the effect options that you have here in Final Cut X, and if you're not sure where to find these, you can click on this pane here, and that brings up your video and audio effects. We also have transitions here, titles here. These are generators, which is sort of like Final Cut is generating video right within it there, and those are some backgrounds that you can use for that. And then themes, and these are preset preset video animations that you can customize so it looks like something made specifically for your project. And they look, nice and fancy, but just be careful. This is a popular program, and so you might find that a lot of other users are using these, and it might kind of give away that you're using Final Cut X. So use those sparingly, I'd say. Alright, so that's where all of your different effects can be found. And so, first of all, video and audio effects. And the really cool thing about Final Cut X's effects options here is that you can select a segment in the timeline, and then if you just mouse over an effect, and I'm not even clicking or anything, I'm just mousing over, you can see what the effect would look like on that selected segment in the timeline. And some look like they're not doing anything, and that's because they need to be customized before they're actually going to change anything. They don't have a default setting. And some are very clearly applied. So that's a cool thing. You don't necessarily have to have anything special turned on in order for this to happen. You just have to select a segment in the timeline and then mouse over these video effects to make it work. And then if you happen to find an effect that you like, so let's do something obvious like aged paper. As long as we have the segment selected in the timeline, we can double click and that will apply it. You can also click and drag straight out of the effects window if you want to, if you wanted to apply it to a different segment or just want to make sure you're getting it exactly where you want it. And then with that effect applied and the segment selected, you can go into the inspector here and have a look at your options for that effect. You can see we have aged paper here. We can control the amount of aging that's happening on it, which is not really well, hang on, there we go. Make sure that it's completely turned on there. Okay. And then, actually, this is a good teachable moment. I accidentally dropped it on twice. So you see we have aged paper and aged paper. If you find you're in that situation, you can click on it and hit delete, and that will get rid of the two. So sometimes you can get a whole backlog of effects added here because you weren't really sure what you're doing. So that's why the original change wasn't affecting anything, because I was only changing one of the two aged paper effects. So we don't really need two aged paper effects. Alright, so if you had more effects, you would see them all, video effects, you'd see them all listed under here. And the nice thing is you can click in the blue square and turn these effects on and off, and you can turn off and on all of the effects at once by clicking in that blue square. And then we can also change the mask size. So you see there's sort of a vignetting around the edge there. You can control that. And also, anytime you see this little plus in the square, that means it can be keyframes. So if you wanted this to change over time, you could even make this like a transition, like we're starting here, and then it fades in or it fades out that way by using keyframes. And we'll be talking about keyframes a little bit later. Okay, so that's what you can do. If you want to delete it, you can click and delete it. You can turn it off that way. So there's a lot of controls you have there. And then we also have audio effects. So if we go down here to the effects pane and scroll down to audio, these are all, when we select all, we're seeing all the different effects, and then they're also subdivided into these categories. So if we just wanted to see nostalgia, we could click on that and see that too, those two. But nostalgia is also part of all. So if you're not sure which effect you want to apply, you can click on all, and then you'll see all the different options that you have to go through. So in audio, we could do a similar thing. It takes a slightly more setup to get this right, because as you can see, as I mouse over this, I'm not hearing clip distortion or crusher or anything like that. And that's because I have to set up my editor a little bit differently. It might be working for yours the way it is set up, but just so you know, you have to turn on video skimming and audio skimming, which, if you recall, video skimming means that when you move your mouse around the timeline or through a clip, raw clip, it automatically skims through the video to show you what the video looks like at that particular point. And that, frankly, kind of drives me crazy, so I tend to turn that off. When you have that turned on, you also then have the option for audio skimming, which means that you're going to hear the audio at the same time, which is really maddening. I mean, it has its place in some situations if you're trying to locate an individual sound, but I would go crazy with that on all the time. However, you need to have that turned on in order for this audio effect preview to work. So with that turned on, I can go through and I can hear what these audio effects would sound like if they were applied. Now, it's not hugely helpful to get this sort of audio scrubbing sound, so what you can do is, I'm just moving my mouse, I'm not clicking or anything. You can move your mouse over to an end and then hit spacebar, and then just hear a playback at normal speed. It gives you a little better sense of what that effect's going to sound like. So hit spacebar. And, you know, there's kind of a weird spaceship type sound there. And again, I can double click this or click and drag to apply it. And then again, with this segment selected, I can now go up into the inspector into audio. And now, whoops, sorry, I had a lingering effect in there. Spaceship, I can control the amount of spaceship. I can turn it on or off and tweak a whole bunch of other things. So there are way too many effects with way too many customized settings to go through them all. That would take a long time. So I'd suggest, if you find an effect that you like, to go ahead and apply it and tinker with it and see what results you get. And if you want to, you can always Google that particular effect. You know, Google Spaceship Final Cut X effect and see if you need some more information about what all the different effects do. Okay, so that's video and audio effects. Up next, I'd like to talk about transitions, which is this pane here. And similar to the video and audio effects, you can mouse over. However, Final Cut just shows you two preset images of trees and mountains to give you a sense for what this effect would look like. But it still works. And these effects can be highly customized too, so you're not stuck with what the effect looks like in the window here. You can change that. And there's some kind of nice ones. Wow, looks like the trees are exploding in flames. It's a little bit creepy. So let's add that one. Now, we can click and drag that over the segment that we want to add and release. And if I hit play, you can see I look like I'm bursting into flames. Bloom is a pretty cool effect. Now I want to actually show you something real quick, because you might find, let me see if I can get this to move. Let's see, we gotta go change modes here a second. I want to show you what happens if you try and bring an effect into the timeline when you have no spare video on either side of these edits. So what I mean is that in this, I gotta turn these off. In this outgoing segment, this is the very end. If you see, if I grab the trim, you get the red bracket there. That means that's the very end of this raw clip. There is no more footage after this. And in the incoming clip, again, if I grab the trim, you see that's red. There's no more video over there. So if I zoom in a little bit with Command plus, there is no overlap between these two clips. For a transition to work, there has to be some remaining video in this original clip that hasn't been used in the timeline. And on either side, ideally both would be great. That would give you some flexibility. But at least one of these sides has to have a little extra video so that you can fade the two. You can overlap the two. Without that, there's no available video to overlap. And so if we take a transition and attempt to apply it, Final Cut will be upset with us. It gives us this angry thing. There is not enough extra media beyond clip edges to create the transition. Do you want it, Final Cut X, to fix this for you? And I would say, if you're early on in your project, hit yes. It's because it's going to move things around a little bit. Let me zoom out for you a tiny bit so you can actually see what Final Cut X did there. Holy cow, that's a long clip. Okay. So let me undo that transition and see if we can make it angry again. Okay. So this can take a little while to understand because this is kind of outside the regular operation of most people's lives. They don't think about the remaining raw footage back from a clip in their timeline. But give it a little time, you'll understand it better. Click transition. You see how that bumped over a little bit? And what it did was it moved this 2770 clip over a little bit so that there's some overlap. And it only gave us, I think, about a second of overlap. It's trying to do the minimum amount here. And that allows us to have that transition, okay? And this is normal. You know, I've got an effect going on. Let me turn off that effect, actually. See if that helps with our playback a little bit. Let's see, we can turn off the spaceship audio effect too. So it's normal to see clips kind of drop in frames because this is kind of a lot for the computer to do real time without rendering it. But that's so now Final Cut move this clip over so there's some overlap so we can fade between the two. If I go through this a little bit, what I mean by that is you see that at one point here we're seeing both video at once, right? We're seeing the outgoing clip here and the ingoing clip here. For this to happen, there has to be an overlap. And if the clips don't have any extra video, they can't overlap. This would just be, nothing here until we reached the end of the, depending on where the transition is positioned. There'd be no point where the two clips overlap where you'd see them both at the same time. So Final Cut can do that for you, or you can do it yourself if you want. I mean, a lot of times you're not bringing in the entire clip, so you'll automatically have some space for that. Along with just adding the transition, you can also change the duration, and you can see here this window pops up. This is not my favorite part of Final Cut X, but when you right click or control click and choose change duration, this timer in the middle turns blue and you can punch in a number. So let's say I want it to be half as fast. We're figuring, we probably got about 30 frames per second. I don't know, it could be 24. But anyway, 15 frames would be about half a second. We hit enter and you see the transition shrinks. Now, let me show you something that could create a little bit of an issue for you. I say I want this to be 2 seconds, so I type in 200, I hit enter, okay, go back, and now it says it's 23 frames. What happened to this doesn't look like 2 seconds. 1000, yeah, we're definitely not at 2 seconds. What is going on? And the problem is I've exceeded the maximum duration of this transition. So I can type in 4 hours if I want, and Final Cut's just going to cruelly ignore me. It doesn't give me any error. It doesn't say, sorry, can't go that long. It just gives me the maximum it can give me. So if you find that you're punching in a time and Final Cut is just rejecting it and not saying anything, it's because you don't have enough overlap to do that. If I click on this clip and move it way over here, so we got a lot of overlap, bring back the arrow, and then click on here change duration. We should be able to make that longer if it's smart enough to know. Yeah, it's it's still not letting me do it because there isn't enough in this incoming clip for that to pan out. So we basically, if I make it really easy on myself here, overlap both. Let's see if it'll let me do it now. 5 seconds. There we go. Alright, so transitions can be a little tricky if you don't have a whole lot of overlap between the two of them. And as you get more comfortable with transitions, there are ways that you can work around it. But basically speaking, if you're having trouble applying it, if you're having trouble getting a longer duration, have a look and see if you've got, you know, enough overlap to make that transition actually work. Now that we've applied it, you can click on it and again go in here and let's see, I'll get position over here so you can see. There are things we can customize. It doesn't have to be arrows. It can be round. It can be beveled. We can add motion blur, which creates a sense of, adds a little sense of motion to it because things that are moving tend to blur. So you can add blur to it and that'll make it feel more like it's moving. And so on and so forth. So you can customize transitions that way, which is pretty cool. My final word on transitions is use them sparingly. A lot of times, I'm going to delete that one. A lot of times video looks better just cutting rather than having, you know, crazy transitions back and forth. So if you're going to add any effects to your video, make sure that they're justified or somehow they match the format of your video. Don't just do it because you can. I mean, certainly as you're starting in Final Cut X, and you can play around and add things and experiment, but when you're looking to do videos for the rest of us, don't apply stuff just because you can, or you're trying to show off that your editor has this particular effect. Make sure it actually relates to what you're trying to do. All right, let's talk about text now. Text is easily marked here with the T. And again, you have a whole bunch of different options for text. You have 3D text, which isn't, you know, 3D in the sense that it, you know, it's 3D to us. It just has depth to it, which is a little hard to see when it's just black. White on black. Then you got some 3D cinematic ones, which are supposed to look sort of like, you know, if they're for a big time movie. Build in, build out are titles that kind of, well, they sort of build in or build out, meaning that there's an animation that brings the title in or brings the title out. Bumpers, openers are things for you. If you imagine like a news show or something like that, they might say coming up next, and it'll have some kind of video with an animation or something and some titles. You know, next on the show is so and so. That would be considered a bumper. Sorry. And then an opener would be at the beginning of the show. You know, today on whatever talk show you're working on. And then there's credits. You got some static ones, which are kind of nice. A preset here to look like the end of trailer. And then we got some push and slide credits, and whole boatload of different way of running credits. Here's some generic ones here at the top, just regular old scrolling. Again, you can customize the font, the size of the font, all that. And then a slate, which is kind of nice. This is what we typically would put at the beginning of a video if we're going to go send it off to be broadcast. So you'd put that at the beginning so people knew what it was. Then they got some custom elements here that you might want to add. An instant replay graphic, speech bubbles, all sort of stuff that Final Cut has created for you. And then lower thirds. And lower thirds are what we typically use to identify people in our video. It's their name and title, and it goes in the lower third of the video, which is why they call it a lower third. So they have a whole bunch of preset ones here. You could also use these for, you know, saying, I don't know, high school in a certain town or something like that. But those are lower thirds. Those are pretty common. So all sorts of options for titles, and we're going to just grab a static one, and let's see here, custom I think is one that works pretty well for that. And so we can click and drag it in if we want to. A bunch of different ways you can do that, and that works like a connected clip, because a lot of times we want title over video. So if you didn't want that, you could always drag it down to your main storyline here, but generally we like to have title over video. And then like other effects, you can click on it and then see all the different options for controlling it. So the main one being changing the text. So if you click on text, whoops, sorry, didn't have that selected properly. Oh man, I made it so mad. Let's try that again. Clicking on the text. Waiting for Final Cut X to forgive me for all the... Instead of taking that as text entering, it just thinks that I entered in a boatload of shortcuts. So let's see if we can make it happy now. Okay. Change the text. So that's what happens when you mash the keyboard. A whole bunch of shortcuts all happen at once. So make sure you got the cursor blinking in there, and then we're good to go. Alright, we can change the font. We can change the size, the alignment, vertical alignment, advanced settings, all kinds of crazy options there. So there's lots of things that we can do to customize it, which is great because that's what we want to do. We also can change the position of the text manually if we want to. And the text talks about you have to find the transform option, which is actually hiding under here. So crop is what typically is the default here. If you click on transform, now you can click and drag this around. You can if you grab this little sort of wing coming off the edge handle, you can rotate it, you can shrink it vertically, horizontally, all these sorts of things. And if you feel like you need to come out a little bit more, you can change the view here to zoom out, and now you can see outside of the frame a little bit easier, which is nice if you're trying to grab these corners. And then when you're set, you can go back to fit and you can hit done. And if you're not messing with keyframes, you'll just end up with a static text like that. Alright, so that's this transform hiding under here. And you can transform other things too. I mean, it doesn't, not just text. If we click on the video and have transform selected, we can move our video around too. So let me undo that, get that back together there. Let's see. Other things you can control. It's good to have your playhead right over the text so you can see the changes as you're making it, and make sure you got it selected. That should change the inspector here. If we click on normal, we have a whole bunch of other styles. You can see that are pre-created. Neon. We got 3D styles, Chrome. My computer is struggling to handle Chrome. So we'll stick with 2D styles for right now. And if we find that we're in a situation where it's too big, then we can go in and change the size of our text to get it back down, whoops, to fit the screen. So I think this sort of stuff is pretty straightforward. A whole bunch of different options for customizing things, drop down options here. You can save if you create a text and you really like it, you can go ahead and save the appearance, and that is great for being able to apply it to a whole bunch of different texts. Because when you're making a video, you typically want to be consistent in your text formatting. You don't want to, have text look one way at one time and another way at a different time, generally speaking. So if you go and do a whole bunch of customization on text and you really like it, you can save the appearance or the format and the appearance, and then apply that later. So that's great. Now, let's also talk about fading in your text, because typically it looks better. Get my computer to catch up here. Not to have the text just pop in like that and pop out. So how can we get that to fade in? Well, certainly you can add transitions to text just like you add transitions to video, but built within the text is this option to fade it right within itself, which is kind of nice. If we control click or right click on the title and choose show video animation, we have this opacity option. So if I click on that little display box there, now I can see basically like a graph of the opacity, and if I want, I can click and drag out these little buttons here, these little markers, and that's basically showing that the opacity is going from 0 to 100 and then 100 back down to 0. And so when we look at that, you see the text fades in and the text then fades out. If we click on here again, we can change the timing. The longer I drag this out, the slower it's going to be fading out, and then the closer that is to the edge, the shorter it is. And so that's a kind of nice way to fade your text in and out, get it just the way that you want it, and you don't have to mess with adding other effects to the edges. And then when you're done with that, you can hide video animation. And, kind of the funny thing is you can't even tell that has a fade in and out until you play it. So it's kind of nice. It kind of simplifies your timeline in terms of not having other elements like transitions and whatnot hanging off the edges of it. Now I want to briefly talk about keyframing text. And there's a number of ways to do that. One thing that's kind of cool is that Final Cut builds it right into the viewer for you here. So we can go the way keyframing is a little bit complicated, but basically what you do in keyframing is you say, okay, Final Cut, at this point in time, I want this factor, whatever it is, position, scale, opacity, anything that can change over time. I want it to look like this at this point. And then however far later on, it could be a few seconds, it could be half an hour, whatever. At another point, I want it to look like this. And Final Cut will change that element so that it shifts from the settings you have it in point A to the settings you have it in point B. All right. So for example, if I want this text to start in one position and then move to another position in the screen and stop, I can go and say, okay, here is where I want it to start moving. So I'm going to go and say add keyframe, and I want it to start moving here, and I want it to move over here. I want it to be stop moving at this point, so I add another keyframe, and then I click and drag where I want it to go. This gets a little bit tricky for people who aren't terribly familiar with keyframing, but you'll get a handle on it, I'm sure, over time. So now we have two keyframes. We have this position here and this position here. And so anytime there's not a keyframe, it's just there's not a shift between keyframes, nothing's going to change. And so we can click through our keyframes, and if we see a blue arrow, it means there's another keyframe to the right or the left. And if we see white, then there's no keyframes. So because there's no keyframes from this point over, it's just this whole point is going to remain in this position And then at this keyframe, it's going to change the text so that it moves and finishes moving once it reaches this keyframe. And because there's no keyframes after here, it just stops. So keyframes are sort of a way of telling Final Cut, I want this thing to be in this place at this time. It's almost like making an appointment with a clip or something, you know. I want this text to be here at this certain time. All right. So now if we play this clip through, it's going to fade in, and then it's going to move, and then it's going to fade out. Okay? So experiment with that a little bit. Keyframes are tricky. They take a little while to sort out, and they can create some problems. But one of the simpler ones to do are these moves. And my recommendation for you is put the first keyframe where you want the move to start, put the second keyframe where you want the move to end, and then adjust them, you know, where you want that particular title or whatever element it is to be at the beginning of the move and at the end of the move. All right. If there's no difference between keyframes, if it's exactly the same position here as it is in the other keyframe, then nothing will change. There has to be two keyframes next to each other with some sort of factor that's different between them, and that's what Final Cut will gradually change over time. All right? And this goes back to the days of animation where, you know, Disney animators, their most talented animators would draw these key frames. So if it was like, you know, Mickey whacking somebody with a hammer, it'd be like one keyframe with a hammer over his head, and then the second keyframe with the hammer hitting whatever it is. I don't think Mickey was that violent, but you get the point. And then they'd have these in-betweener animators who would draw the hammer progressively moving between those 2 points. And so Final Cut it's doing a similar thing. It's saving you the time of like physically moving this title a little bit each time. You're just saying, hey, Final Cut, I want you to gradually shift. I want you to spread this movement out over this period of time. And the nice thing is it really makes it easy for you to jump between keyframes. And if you decide you don't like one, you can hit the keyframe go away button. Now we only have one keyframe. And since we don't have two keyframes, nothing can change. And so even though we've added a keyframe, nothing's going to move because we need two keyframes with different settings for any sort of keyframing effect to work. So I'm sorry that keyframing is a little bit tricky. I'm sure that you will get a handle on it as you play with it some more. And if you have any specific questions about keyframing, let me know. Now, finally, I want to show you what they're talking about with title and action safe zones in Final Cut. And these used to be a really big deal, and they're not as big a deal as they used to be. So this inner box is the title safe box. And the idea here is that if you have any text that you want people to read, it needs to be inside this box. And then the larger box is the action safe box. And the idea here is that if you have any sort of action that you want people to see, like, I don't know, you got a Muppet waving his arms, all of that should be inside. I don't know why I came up with that, but all that should be inside the action safe zone. And this really goes back to the days when we had those old tube TVs, which I'm imagining a number of you have never even seen. But those old tube TVs would not display the entire picture. So when I was editing back then, I knew that even though on my computer I could see the entire video, when I took it home and watched it on my TV, it would crop off the outside, just the way that those tube TVs worked. They cropped quite a bit off the outside of the video. So it's interesting if you watch some videos today that were shot back then. Sometimes you'll see stuff that they never thought you would see because in the original video it wasn't visible. But anyway, so back then when I was making titles, I really wanted to make sure that my titles were inside the title safe, because if I put it so close to the edge, the audience literally couldn't see it. These days, it's not so much a worry about the audience not being able to see it, because the audience now is going to see the entire picture. Nothing gets cropped off anymore. But it's sort of more of an aesthetic thing. that if you have a title you want somebody to read, it's really unpleasant if it's right up next to the edge of the frame. It just visually looks lousy. All right, and similar with action, it doesn't look good when there's, if you imagine like a painting, it doesn't look that great if there's something really important in the painting that's right next to the edge of the frame. So this is more of a guideline now, more of an aesthetic guideline than a really important technical thing that you need to follow. But if you're going to put text on the screen, I do recommend making sure that the text that people are reading is actually inside this box. If you've got some kind of background behind it, like sometimes lower thirds will have sort of a background behind the text, that can be outside of that. But the text they're actually reading should be inside this title safe box. And then if you have any sort of action, maybe you're bringing in an effect or something you got something you want people to see, position that so it's inside the action safe area. But just know that the audience is going to see all of the video these days. So if you look at this is a GoPro with a wide angle adapter. You're seeing the edges of that wide angle adapter here. And so when I use this video in my documentary, I'll probably blow this up just a tiny bit to get rid of some of that kind of vignetting that's going on there a little bit, so that the full screen is all picture. So, all right, that is title action safe, and go to view here, and you can turn that on and off. And it is an important thing to do and use when you're creating titles if you're going to be anywhere near the edges. Okay, great. So that's the first part of effects. Next time we'll talk about generators and themes and some other elements of effects in Final Cut X. Thanks a lot.